In September 1965, American television audiences were invited to leave Earth behind. The destination was a distant future. The vehicle was a flying saucer called the Jupiter 2, and the passengers were the Robinson family, a group of scientists and explorers who were supposed to begin a new life among the stars. But the real story of Lost in Space was far more complicated than the adventures viewers saw on Wednesday nights. Before the famous robot warned, "Danger, Will Robinson," before Dr. Zachary Smith became one of television's most memorable villains, and before the series transformed into colorful science fiction fantasy, there was another version of the show, a darker, more serious production that CBS never broadcast as a regular episode. That forgotten beginning helps explain how one of the strangest shows of the 1960s became a lasting part of American pop culture. The story begins with producer Irwin Allen, a Hollywood filmmaker who had already built a reputation for spectacular adventure productions. At a time when the American public was fascinated by the space race, Allen understood that outer space could become powerful television material. The United States and the Soviet Union were competing to reach new milestones beyond Earth, and NASA's Gemini program was keeping spaceflight constantly in the headlines. Allen wanted to bring that fascination into American homes. But his original concept for Lost in Space was considerably more serious than the version that eventually became famous. He developed a pilot called No Place to Hide, and CBS agreed to consider it as the foundation for a new science fiction series. The surviving pilot is about 52 minutes long and was photographed in black and white. In that original pilot, the Robinson family was not yet trapped in the colorful universe audiences would later associate with the series. John Robinson was an accomplished scientist and the head of the family. Maureen was a scientist in her own right, while their children Judy, Penny, and Will were exceptionally capable young people. Major Don West served as the expedition's pilot. Together, they were traveling aboard the Gemini 12 toward Alpha Centauri, where they hoped to establish a new human settlement. The mission was supposed to represent a new chapter for humanity, but space had other plans. A meteor storm damaged the spacecraft, sending it off course and leaving the family stranded on an unknown world. The atmosphere of No Place to Hide was significantly different from the later series. There was no Dr. Smith manipulating the family, and there was no B-9 robot standing beside Will Robinson. Instead, the pilot concentrated on the Robinsons themselves and their struggle to survive. The family was presented as intelligent, cooperative, and resourceful. Their problems came from the hostile environment around them rather than from a recurring human antagonist. In other words, the original concept was closer to a serious survival drama in space than to the campy adventure series that would eventually dominate syndicated television. CBS ultimately decided that the concept needed something more. The solution was a character who could create conflict inside the family's already dangerous situation. That character was Dr. Zachary Smith, played by Jonathan Harris. Smith was introduced as an enemy agent who sabotaged the mission, and the aired premiere, The Reluctant Stowaway, was built around his actions. The robot was also added to the series, becoming both a machine designed for environmental control and, eventually, one of its most recognizable characters. Contemporary television reference material describes Smith sneaking aboard the Jupiter 2, reprogramming the robot to destroy the ship, and accidentally becoming trapped aboard when the spacecraft launched. But Jonathan Harris brought something to Smith that changed the entire future of the program. Instead of remaining simply a threatening villain, Harris played him with theatrical exaggeration, vanity, cowardice, and comic timing. That performance gave the writers a character who could be dangerous one moment and ridiculous the next. Smith's relationship with the robot became particularly important, while young Will Robinson became another major focus. The combination of the frightened, scheming doctor, the brilliant child, and the mechanical robot gradually became more important to the show's identity than the original survival premise. This transformation is one of the most fascinating things about Lost in Space. The show did not simply begin as the colorful fantasy remembered by many viewers. Its earliest material reveals a more restrained concept, and footage from the original pilot was subsequently reused and incorporated into the regular series. Almost the entire pilot eventually found its way into the first several episodes, although it was combined with newly filmed material and contained noticeable differences from the finished program. The pilot was also unusual because it remained unseen by the American television audience for decades. No Place to Hide was produced in the mid-1960s, but it was not broadcast as part of the original run. It finally reached viewers in 1993 when the Sci-Fi Channel presented it in a special called Pilot Playhouse. That delayed broadcast allowed fans to see something that had previously existed mainly as a piece of television history. The early version of Lost in Space before Smith and the Robot became central to the story. Then the real series arrived. On September 15, 1965, Lost in Space officially premiered on CBS. The timing could hardly have been better. Americans were already captivated by space exploration, and television was increasingly experimenting with ambitious science fiction productions. The first season maintained a darker visual atmosphere because it was filmed in black and white. The Robinsons were stranded, vulnerable, and surrounded by dangers they did not understand. The show still had fantastic elements, but there was a stronger sense that survival mattered. At the center of that family was Guy Williams as Professor John Robinson. Williams had already become famous through Zorro, and his presence gave the series a recognizable heroic figure. June Lockhart played Maureen Robinson, bringing warmth and authority to the family. Mark Goddard played Major Don West, while Marta Kristen and Angela Cartwright portrayed Judy and Penny Robinson. Bill Mumy played the youngest Robinson, Will, whose intelligence and curiosity eventually made him one of the show's most important characters. And then there was Jonathan Harris. His Dr. Smith was supposed to be a serious threat, but Harris's performance pushed the character into something much stranger. Smith became vain, self-preserving, theatrical, and often hilariously frightened. Rather than being eliminated from the story, he became one of its most recognizable figures. The Robot, meanwhile, became Will Robinson's loyal companion. Its physical presence came from performer Bob May inside the suit, while Dick Tufeld provided the distinctive voice that made warnings such as "Danger, Will Robinson" unforgettable. The relationship between Will, Smith, and the Robot gradually changed the balance of the series. The original premise had centered on a family trying to survive on an alien planet. But television audiences discovered that they were equally interested in the strange relationship among a brilliant child, a cowardly doctor, and a highly expressive machine. That dynamic created humor and emotional familiarity, allowing the series to become more accessible to younger viewers. The change became even more obvious in the second season. Lost in Space moved into color, and its visual identity exploded. The darker atmosphere of the first season gave way to brighter costumes, stranger aliens, more elaborate sets, and increasingly fantastical stories. Instead of focusing primarily on realistic survival, episodes could involve bizarre planets, unusual creatures, eccentric rulers, time distortions, and comedic situations. The show increasingly embraced the imagination of television rather than the scientific seriousness that had characterized its earliest concept. This evolution was not necessarily a failure. In fact, it helped create the version of Lost in Space that audiences remembered most strongly. Critics could complain about the increasingly campy stories, but children and families often responded to exactly what made the show unusual. It was colorful, unpredictable, funny, and filled with characters who could be recognized immediately. The series had become less concerned with convincing viewers that space travel might really work, and more interested in taking them somewhere entertaining. That distinction became crucial to the show's long-term legacy. Lost in Space ran for 3 seasons and a total of 83 episodes before ending in 1968. Its original broadcast run was not the end of the story. Once episodes entered syndication, local stations could show them repeatedly, often introducing the program to children who had not even been born when the Robinson family first appeared on CBS. The show therefore developed a second life after its network cancellation. The phrase "Lost in Space" also had an interesting history beyond television. Gold Key Comics had already published a science fiction comic called Space Family Robinson, beginning in 1962, before the CBS series premiered. The comic and television series shared the Robinson family name and the broad idea of a family traveling through space. The two properties were ultimately connected through an agreement rather than the dramatic courtroom battle, sometimes described in later retellings. Gold Key changed the comic's cover title to Space Family Robinson, Lost in Space, beginning with issue number 15. The relationship between the comic and television program is therefore an important part of the franchise's history, but it should not be confused with claims that a massive lawsuit nearly stopped the television series. The show also became important in the history of television merchandising. Viewers did not simply want to watch the Jupiter 2. They wanted toys, models, games, lunchboxes, trading cards, and other objects connected to the series. The robot was especially suited to merchandising because its distinctive design could be recognized instantly. This helped demonstrate an important truth about television. A successful fictional universe could live beyond the screen. Characters and vehicles could become products that children carried into their everyday lives. And then there were the people who made the show memorable. Guy Williams remained closely associated with both John Robinson and his earlier role as Zorro. After Lost in Space, he largely withdrew from Hollywood and eventually lived in Argentina, where he remained particularly beloved because of Zorro. He died in 1989. June Lockhart continued acting for decades after the series ended and became one of the most enduring figures associated with classic American television. Her career also remained connected to public interest in space exploration. She died in October 2025 at the age of 100, leaving behind a career that stretched across generations. Jonathan Harris continued working extensively after Lost in Space, including voice acting, and remained strongly identified with Dr. Smith. Bill Mumy also built a long career beyond his childhood fame. He became a musician, writer, voice performer, and science fiction actor, later appearing as Lennier on Babylon 5. Mumy continued to participate in Lost in Space reunions and helped preserve memories of the original series. The supporting cast also left their own marks. Mark Goddard remained associated with Major Don West, while Marta Kristen and Angela Cartwright continued working in creative fields. Their careers were different, but all of them shared an unusual experience. They had been part of a television series that initially seemed like a conventional science fiction adventure and gradually became something much more eccentric. Perhaps the most remarkable legacy belongs to the robot. More than half a century after the original series ended, its design remains instantly recognizable. It became a symbol of classic television science fiction, alongside the Jupiter 2 and Drive Smith. The machine was not merely a special effect. Through Bob May's physical performance and Dick Tuffel's voice, the robot became a character with personality, loyalty, fear, humor, and emotion. The franchise continued to return in new forms. A feature film arrived in 1998, and later a modern television version introduced the Robinson family to a new generation. The original cast members were also honored through appearances and references connected to later adaptations. The continued reinvention of the property demonstrates how durable the central concept became. A family separated from Earth, trying to survive together somewhere beyond the familiar world. Yet the most revealing chapter may still be the forgotten pilot. No Place to Hide shows us what Lost in Space might have become if CBS had accepted the original concept without major changes. It presents a family-centered survival story without Dr. Smith and without the robot. Instead of the flamboyant fantasy that audiences eventually received, viewers might have been watching a much more serious science fiction drama. That alternate history is what makes Lost in Space so fascinating. The series we remember was created through evolution, compromise, performance, and changing audience expectations. A serious space survival concept became a family adventure. A villain became a comic icon. A machine became a beloved character. A network science fiction program became a merchandising phenomenon and eventually a multi-generational franchise. And perhaps that is the real secret behind Lost in Space. Its greatest strength was not scientific accuracy, realism, or even consistency. It was imagination. The show could change because its audience was willing to travel with it. The first season could be tense and atmospheric. The later seasons could be colorful and outrageous. Dr. Smith could be selfish and cowardly, yet somehow remain indispensable. The robot could be a machine, yet feel like a member of the family. And Will Robinson could stand at the center of it all, representing the curiosity that had taken America toward the stars in the first place. More than 60 years later, the Jupiter 2 still occupies a special place in American television history. The original pilot, once unseen by the public, has become a fascinating window into what the series might have been. The characters who survived the cancellation became cultural icons, and the strange mixture of science fiction, family adventure, comedy, and fantasy eventually outlived the era that created it. Lost in Space may have started with a family searching for a new world, but its real journey was much larger. It traveled from black and white television into color, from network schedules into syndication, from toys and comic books into later films and television adaptations, and finally into the memories of generations of viewers. The Robinsons were lost in space, but the show itself was never truly lost. It found its way into American popular culture and, decades later, remains one of the most recognizable journeys ever launched from a television screen.